Welcome back. In this lesson, I will be introducing you to International Accounting Standard Board. There are different types of accounting regulations. In some places, there is no such a law or legislation that would regulate how companies should be reporting and disclosing their financial information. In some countries, accounting regulations is drafted and led as a project by professional bodies, for example, in the UK. In some places, accounting regulations or disclosure regulations related is drafted by the government, for example, in Central Europe, like France, Italy, and Germany. Who is drafting the accounting regulations would have a strong impact on how the regulations is designed, what the kind of the basis, what kind of the things they're covering. So for example, if the regulations is being set up by the government, then they would consider that the government as the main users. They would tend to regulate what the company should be doing and the behavior that could be deemed as acceptable. Professional bodies, on the other hand, where they tend to be considered about what are the information are produced are generally is in the request of the market or of the capital provider. So in their design of the accounting standard, they would be more considered about what the market would want, what kind of the information they think would be appropriate in order to facilitate someone to make an effective decision making. Or it could be set up by some independent bodies. So it neither belongs to any of a particular government, which seems to have their own particular interest, nor is being constrained purely by the consideration of the capital. The globalization and the deregulation of the financial market has led to increasing the accounting harmonization. And this has gradually contributed and built up the internationalization of accounting standards over the time. Let's take UK as an example. In UK, listed companies must use international accounting standards that are IFRS for their group accounts. Other companies can choose whether to use international standard or UK standard, and they're now based on IFRS. In America, companies could use US GAAP, EU, which is very similar to the UK. So maybe have a think about what about the non-EU or non-US countries? What kind of the standards they're using, for example, what kind of standards that Chinese company is using? What kind of the standards that is using, for example, in African countries? Although there is a global trend moving towards a single set of accounting standards, there are various obstacles. The scales of difference in accounting practices and the strength of the accounting profession. And this would mean that in different places, different accounting community, they would have a different preference, what kind of information, what things they would see is the most important for their company and for their users. And the values would affect how they want to disclose information, how they want to measure things. Are they tend to be more conservative? Are they tend to be more optimistic? Or are they tend to be more neutral and trying to be more transparent? Nationalism would also affect the development of accounting standards internationally. It partly is due to that the individual state would not want to give up control over their accounting practices. In different places, they would also have different type of primary users. So in some places, the government would be the primary user, banks would be the primary users. In some other places where, for example, they are very much being dominated by equity financed country, it is most likely capital markets, the shareholders, institutional investors. A legal system could have a strong impact. In common law system, for example, in the UK, which is typical case for common law, they do not have a particular commercial law regarding what they think the business should do. So thus the accounting standard and also the accounting regulations is very much being drafted by accounting professions. Whereas in France, Italy, and Germany, their legal system is a code law, which means they do have a law on regulating what should be disclosed, how things should be measured, how things should be accounted, and those things are actually being codified into law. And they would have a different ways of expectations what they see accounting standards should be look like. Culture would definitely have an influence on people's attitude in terms of transparency, secrecy, about disclosure, conservatism, about measurement, etc. Language would be another issue that affecting the internationalization. In some places, they may not have the exact words to allow an English translation to be possible. Enforcement, how accounting standards actually be enforced. So in some there is no international accounting regulatory agents which is trying to enforcing the standards, but in each place they have different bodies that is trying to enforcing the standard compliance. International Accounting Standard Board that we have been talking so far, its predecessor IASB was established in 1973. It is the standard setting body of the IFRS Foundation. So overall, its IFRS Foundation is consisted by the advisory council, the governance body committee. In addition to IASB, they also have interpretation council. So on the standard board, sitting on them, there are 14 members. Up to 4 are from Asia, Oceania, 4 from Europe, 4 from North America, 1 from Africa, 1 from South America, and 2 others. There are different approaches to think about how to set up accounting standard. An inductive approach, it allows us to start from the phenomenon, that is from the experience, by looking at what are the things, how we're doing that, and trying to figure out how we can deal with similar things next time. So it's coming from the experience and generalize some kind of standards which allows us to use for the next time. The issue with this kind of approach would be if there's something that we have not come across before, then we kind of lost the anchor, we lost the direction, so we don't know how to deal with it. So we have to do trial and error and before we actually figure out how to approach it. A deductive approach, which starts from a different perspective. It starts from the basic propositions and assumptions, and therefore it develops accounting principles that are generated from some kind of accounting theory, and then it would develop a kind of logical conclusions about what kind of the standards then we can generate it from those principles. So it proposed a kind of normative approach. The good thing about it is it allows us to have a systematic approach to kind of guide us to design standards, and if we have came across things that we have never met before, we will still know how can we actually approach it, what kind of the theory that we can referring to, and how we kind of derive from that phenomenon. Regulatory approach, which is comprised of a mixture of deductive, inductive, and sometimes it also embedded some kind of political element. And it is argued that this is the current approach that the conceptual framework is working in order to provide some theoretical basis. The first document was published in 1989. That was the first draft of a conceptual framework developed by IASB, and that was based on FASB's ideas of conceptual framework. And after that, IASB joined together with FASB working on a joint conceptual framework, and they're working together trying to converge the financial state accounting standard. Between 2005 and 2010, the joint project paused. 2010, the IASB decided to proceed alone. In 2014, FASB decided to proceed them alone by themselves. 2015, IASB exposure draft, that's the end of the comments. And then 2018, the conceptual framework has been released. And 2020, which is this year, the January, the new conceptual framework becoming effective. I would spend a bit of time of explaining a little bit about the IASB and FASB joint conceptual framework because that has a huge influence on the today's version of the conceptual framework we've been looking at. From this table, you will be able to see how the US GAAP is converging towards IFRS and how IFRS are actually adapting some of the perspective from the US GAAP and taking that to the IAS standard. I will not go line by line, but if you're interested, you can actually pause the video and look into detail what are the items